And if you have not yet paid your Anshe Emet membership dues, you can include the sisterhood dues in your payment. You can also pay separately, but we'd love to have you as a member. Please feel free to email me if you want to be on our mailing list, or if you have any questions about becoming a member. And I put my email on the chat a little while ago, so it's up there. The sisterhood is still looking for a few good sisters. We are accepting names for next year's board. We are hoping to get a variety of women throughout the community, including younger women and including people from the various communities within our shul. We're also looking for women that may have some special talents, including someone maybe who is involved with graphic design, social media, or communications. If you are interested in helping us out, please send me an email, and we can put your skills to use. So we're honored to once again have Rabbi Marianne Novak present on behalf of the sisterhood. Rabbi Novak is quite accomplished and has an extensive presence within both the St. Louis and Jewish communities. She received her ordination from Yeshivat Maharat in 2019, and prior to that, received her JD from Washington University School of Law and her BA in Political Science from Barnard College. Even before becoming a rabbi, Marianne had been very involved in both teaching and in the running of ritual services, and is currently a frequent lecturer and writes a blog for the Times of Israel. Marianne has been an instructor and curriculum developer for the Florence Melton Adult School of Jewish Learning for over 21 years, and she taught Tanakh at the Rochelle Zell Jewish High School. She's currently a fellow in the Created Equal Educators Fellowship of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Marianne lives in Skokie with her husband and her family. And we're happy to have you, and feel free to take it from here.
Thank you, Marlene. It's my pleasure to be again learning with the sisterhood of Anshe Emet. I had a pleasure of, before pandemic, of teaching an entire class on Job to a wonderful group of people. And it's really my pleasure to be learning with you again. Anshe Emet, in my family, my parents grew up in Lakeview. My mother grew up in Anshe Emet. It's a coming into the doors of the synagogue. It's very much like home for me, because when we would visit my grandparents, we would come and visit Anshe Emet. So it's very much part of my family. And where my father, who's a rabbi, he walked into a Talmud class in the library where I taught, and met a group of people there and pushed, and they helped him on his way to become a rabbi. So my connections to Anshe Emet are really very, very strong and go back many, many, many years. So today we're going to talk about hair and head covering for women in the Jewish tradition. And before I go any further, I just want to frame this a little bit. I'm going to be talking about this aspect of covering hair for married women and the tradition of married women in Judaism to cover their hair. This is different than talking about covering your head when you're praying. So let's say men wearing a kippah or covering their hair. Now, in egalitarian spaces, like Anshe Emet and other places, these two items might be put together. But from what I'm talking about now, I'm specifically talking about an obligation for married women under traditional Jewish law to cover their hair, and what that looks like now, where it comes from within Jewish law and tradition, and what it looks like now. So I just want to make that kind of clear, because at least for traditional Jewish law, the obligations for a married woman to cover her hair is very different than a man covering his head during prayer. So I just want to frame it that way, because actually the obligation is not the same, at least traditionally. Now within egalitarian spaces, then everyone can be covering their head or not within prayer spaces. So I just want to explain exactly where I'm coming from, so that hopefully that will not be confusing. I'm going to share with you my screen right now, and it's been put into the chat, a couple of different items. We're going to look at a source sheet. Don't be overwhelmed. It's a lot of material. We're not going to go through every single thing. but you will have the sources available. It's actually prepared by Rabbi Dov Linzer. Rabbi Dov Linzer is the head of the yeshiva Chovevei Torah, which is kind of the brother institution to where I received my ordination, Yeshivat Maharat. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go through the traditional sources and kind of see how the obligation or not obligation of hair covering specifically for married women, maybe for women in general, we'll see. And we'll see how the law develops, and we'll see how the impact of society, and specifically the impact of women's behavior and in the behaviors that they decide to take upon themselves, how that impacts what the law looks like. And that's a very important thing. And hopefully by the end, I will also address, there's a public and private issue. And I think right now, since we're sitting on Zoom, the question is, do you have to cover your hair when you go on a Zoom call? Is that considered public or not? So hopefully we will get there. And this is an issue that I'm thinking about, but what it looks like now. So I'm going to share my screen. And again, please don't be overwhelmed, but I want us to get kind of a feeling of the scope of where this question goes. And also the impact on women's behavior, even though they do not have a voice within traditional halachic Jewish legal works, their behavior and their practice has a big impact, even to this day. So I want us to see that. So I'm gonna do this now. Hopefully this will, I'm trying to find it. Okay, let's see. Nope. Shoot. Okay, do you guys see that or no? You don't see that. Okay, I'm gonna go back and we're gonna try this again. Shoot. Okay, hold on one second. I am sorry. Okay, voila, there we go. All right, fantastic. I'm sorry about that, I had it up. Okay, so the first question when we're looking at this from a Jewish legal point of view is to see if there's any place in the Torah, specifically in the 5 books of Moses, that might give us some direction. Meaning, do we have a specific directive in the Torah that says a married woman should cover her hair? So there's nothing exactly on point. And the jumping off point actually is from a very controversial and unpleasant part of the Torah. We actually read it not too long ago. And that's the first source that I'm looking at here. It's from Numbers. It's from the book of the Midbar, which explains this very strange ceremony of the sota. So what is the sota? The sota is this woman who's married and her husband has a hunch that she might have cheated on him. And so he brings her to the high priest in the temple court, and they have this very strange kind of voodoo kind of ritual. I hate to put it that way, but she drinks bitter waters. There's a whole process of humiliating her. And if she drinks it, and if she's guilty, her thigh will explode, her womb will explode. And if not, then her husband can't divorce her and they're stuck together. And apparently then they will have many children. So it's a very strange ritual. We don't do it anymore. We had probably never was actually ever done. But this is where we learn about possibly that it was the custom or the practice of a married woman to cover her hair. So let's take a look at what this is. And this is part of this very strange ritual. You can take a look at it. Where the priest, he sets the woman before the Lord and he uncovers her hair and puts an offering of memorial. So what we see is that, okay, she's a married woman, and this whole ceremony is meant to truly humiliate her. And one way of humiliating her is uncovering her hair. The words in the Hebrew are ufara et rosh ha'isha. And farah doesn't mean to necessarily uncover, it means to actually make someone disheveled, but it's a way of humiliation. But this is the jumping off point, that our tradition sees that, well, if she's a married woman and part of the humiliation is to uncover her head, then perhaps her practice as a married woman in her dignity and modesty is to cover her hair. But again, it takes a lot of logical leaps to get there. And we will see this kind of tension within how the law develops of whether this is really a biblical law, which would have a great deal of weight and standing, or is it a rabbinic law? And you will see even in the early commentators, we're going to take a look at that now, is that they don't really, they ascribe a lot of what this rule is to the practice of what married women did in those times. But they can't really hang it so strongly on a biblical law, even though they try. They really, really try. So let's take a look at some of the early commentators that we have on this specific verse in the Torah. So the first one we're going to look at is source number 2. It comes from the Sifrei. The Sifrei is probably the oldest commentary that we have on the book of Numbers. Ancient meaning, in traditional circles, it would be considered to be a commentary that came at the same time of Revelation. I'm not going to date it for you, but it's one of the oldest commentaries that they have. And they pick up on this word of ufara et rosh ha'isha. And he uncovers the head of the woman. And if you notice, here's the logical leap in the Sifrei. Another interpretation, this teaches us regarding Jewish women, literally it says Benot Yisrael, daughters of Israel, that they cover their hair. But if you notice the next line, it says, although there is no proof to this, there is an indication to this, as it says in another place in the Torah, in the second book, second book of Samuel, Tamar placed covering on her head. Now, both the places that they're talking about here, the Sota incident, which is terribly problematic, and this is the Tamar who was one of King David's daughters, who was then raped by her stepbrother, her half-brother. And she was showing that after she had sex, against her will, she put ashes on her head. Granted, these are very tenuous places that we're getting legal proofs from. But if you notice what the Sifrei says, there's something about it that this teaches us that Jewish women do it. And if you notice, it's really, again, doing those extra logical leap, and it's regarding the actual behavior of Jewish women. So you're not going to find something directly on point that says married women have to cover their hair. The Torah says so. It takes a lot of logical leaps, and there's a lot of possible room for interpretation. And we see that almost immediately. If we look at source number 3, this comes from Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, the medieval French commentator, on the same verse in the Torah. He explains that ufara doesn't mean to uncover, it means to unbraid. And there's been a lot of talk about this now. Those of you who might be doing the daily page of Gemara and the daily daf, this actually came up in 95a, on page 95a in Masechet Shabbat. And I'm going to explain what I mean here. The idea is that if the process was to humiliate her, when he was uncovering her, he was really just undoing her hairdo. So perhaps, because if you can imagine that the style at the time, and there's been some social anthropologists who've actually done some research about this, the style at the time was that if women were going out, their hair was going to be tightly braided. So you can imagine if someone came and you wore your hair tightly braided, those of you like maybe in the 80s who used to crimp your hair, I never had to do that, my hair is very curly, but crimp your hair, you would braid your hair overnight and you'd wake up and you can imagine. So if that was her style, then a way to humiliate her was to undo her braids. And you can imagine what she might have looked like. She might have looked like a totally disheveled and a recluse as a way of humiliation. So again, we don't have a clear view of exactly what is being uncovered or what the actual event is going on. What's the humiliation? But what it reflects is the practice of what they saw of what women were doing. So even from Rashi, even from the Sifrei, there's something going on about, okay, there's some way that a married woman has to present herself regarding her hair. It might be covering it in some way. It might be that it has to be kempt and done before she goes out into public. But this is where the starting point is. Now, later on in the Talmudic text, which then are an explanation of oral law that eventually gets written down, we have in the Babylonian Talmud, these 2 pages from the Talmud, which become actually really the source point for women covering their hair. And what they're discussing here in this specific part of the Gemara is, it's called Ketuvot. It's a section of the Talmud that has to do with a ketubah, a legal marriage contract, and it talks all about marriage, of when a ketubah must be written, when a ketubah must be paid or not paid. Just to talk about ketubah for 1 second, in the Torah text, all it says about regarding divorce and marriage is that a man, if he finds something that he doesn't like in his wife, he writes her a bill of divorcement and she goes on her way. And what this was very problematic, because there was no incentive for a man, and he could also have more than one wife at some point in time. So there was no incentive for him to actually stay married. A ketubah, and it would leave women who were divorced in terrible shape with no support, no nothing. Certainly in ancient times, not like they could go get a job. That's not what happened. So a ketubah in and of itself is a rabbinic construction that is meant to prevent men from divorcing their wives at a drop of a hat, and also it protects women. It's not perfect, but it protects women. So if divorce would happen, that they would get some support. Now, in this discussion in the Gemara, what they're asking is, well, if he wants to divorce her, that's okay, or if she wants, she can initiate in some way divorce. That's a whole other discussion. But if she does something that is truly considered to be against Jewish law or Jewish practice, he can divorce her without giving her a ketubah. And so this is really interesting. And what they talk about are 2 different things. I just want to highlight over here. These women can be divorced without receiving a ketubah. A wife who transgresses the law of Moses, that's dat Moshe, and those who transgress the practice of Jewish women. Now, this is really quite fascinating. So dat Moshe means the law of Moses. It can be considered to be biblical law. It could be law that the rabbis decided was biblical law because they were the ones deciding, especially if it had to be derived. And then there's this other piece, the practice of Jewish women. So the question is, well, what determines practice of Jewish women? Practice of Jewish women seems to be, even when we see this now, as something that relates to how women practiced, what their personal practice was, married women, when they would go out of their homes, or how they would practice covering or not covering their hair. Now, notice they have a discussion here, and that it seems that from a biblical standard, it would be enough when women would go out to the marketplace. That was really what the public place was, is that they wore a basket on their head. Now that sounds kind of funny, but it's the way that they carried their wares. If you see, and you see in some traditional societies right now, you have women who are able to balance this basket on their head. If they had a basket on their head, that was fine, biblically. But if you notice that this last discussion in the Gemara, it says, biblically, it is quite satisfactory if her head is covered by her work basket. That should do. According to traditional Jewish practice, however, she is forbidden to go uncovered even with a basket on her head. Now, it seems that what happened is that the women were doing more. That a basket on her head might have been like fine for that standard, but they recognized that, oh, maybe it needs to be more. And where are they learning this from? They're learning this from the practice of the women themselves. Now, that seems great. It gives women some degree of agency, but very often what happens is sometimes the rabbis take that agency and use it as a stick, as opposed to good agency. So that's what happens. Now, Rashi, again, we're seeing this commentator who not only did commentary on Torah, but also has a very important commentary on the Talmud. I don't think I can learn Talmud without Rashi. Some people say that they can't, but can, but great for them. But he says very interestingly, he's like, well, he's not totally convinced that a woman not covering her hair is going against a biblical prohibition. So I want to read this entire Rashi here because this opens the door here for a different way of thinking about it. So I'm going to read the whole thing. This is source number 5. It is biblical. And why is it not referred to as the law of Moses? If it's biblical, really biblical, it should be considered something that is from Moses helping give revelation at Sinai. And he said, well, a prohibition, since we do such to her, the sota, remember we talked about her, she's going to show up in order to make her ugly, measure for measure. Just as she did practices to make herself beautiful for the man she was having an affair with, having sex with, we can infer that it is forbidden. Alternatively, since it says, and he shall uncover, we can infer that until that point her hair was not uncovered. Thus, it can be concluded that it is not the manner of Jewish women to go out with their head uncovered. And this last explanation is the correct one. So I want to read this last piece again. Thus, it can be concluded that it is not the manner of Jewish women to go out with their hair uncovered. So what is he saying? He's saying, okay, I've inferred all this stuff from Sota, but where am I really learning the rule from? I'm learning it from the practice of what women did. So the practice was that when women went out of their homes, they had their hair covered if they were married. So this is an important explanation here from Rashi, who's a major commentator, opens the door for many other commentators that we're not actually going to look at all of them today, to say maybe we have a little bit of leeway here in deciding what it is, or what the practice is for married women. Where should we look? We don't have a real clear directive from our biblical text, no matter how we're going to try. So Rashi's saying, like, we can't do that. We can't fit it in there. We know it's important, but we're really learning this from the practice of women. Now, the Rambam, Maimonides, was very strict about this and said that women should not go out uncovered into the marketplace. And actually, he was even stronger. He didn't want women going to the marketplace at all. And if we think about in the places where he lived most of his life in Muslim Spain, Islamic Spain. And if we think about even what those practices were, women didn't go out. Women didn't go out. If we think of some, although now I think they can drive in Saudi Arabia, like women in Saudi Arabia couldn't drive until recently because they weren't going to go out by themselves. So the idea of women going out at all, but if they're going to go out, they have to have some degree of being covered. And I think he follows that. Now, and he seems to think it's biblical. He has no trouble with it. In source number 7 here, we have another commentator who comes from the 15th century. A lot of these commentators, just so you know, they get their names from the most important work that they have written. That's not their real name. There's no one named the Trumat Hadeshen, which is actually a description of the temple practice of removing the ashes from the altar. It's sort of like really the holy garbage people. So that's really what it is. And it's actually Israel Isserlin, and he is a 15th century German scholar. And he says that, well, you know what? It's kind of biblical, this directive. There's a hint to it. It's enough of a hint that I'm going to make it a biblical law. And remember, if you make something biblical, it has much more weight within Halakha and less wiggle room. So if something is considered oraita from the Torah or biblical or dat Moshe, you're not going to be able to have a whole lot of leeway. Okay, so we have this idea that at least while going out, a married woman will cover her hair. Now, again, we saw that. What is the status then of a woman who doesn't cover her hair? Does it rise to the level of something that a man would be required to divorce her? So, for example, if a woman is found to have done something that is true against Torah in a very serious manner, here they talk about, well, certainly adultery, or if she wasn't careful with family purity laws, all those kind of things, then he might even be required by the Beit Din to divorce his wife. And the question is, well, what if she doesn't cover her hair? Does this rise to the level of a law that she has broken that will require him to divorce her? And sources that we have here, just to touch at the chase a little bit, they say, well, you know what? He can, and it might be a great idea for him to do so, but they can't find the legal weight that will require him to do so. For example, meaning, if he found that his wife was truly being adulterous, that she was truly having a sexual affair with somebody else, he would be required to divorce her. And here they're saying, well, because it's not really super biblical and we can't really hang it, like, well, we would advise him to do so. And it might be a mitzvah. It would be a good thing for him to do. Not to the level that he's going to be required. Like, it's good, but it's required. And but they can't really say, like, oh, he would absolutely have to. Now, when we come to the 20th century, which we're going to zoom right ahead right now, we're looking at source number 8. It's the Igrot Moshe, and I'm going to explain who that is. Igrot Moshe is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was one of the most important halachic decisors within the Orthodox community. He lived in Belarus, and then he spent most of his time, he moved to the United States in 1936, and he spent most of his life as a rabbi of a synagogue and head of yeshiva on the Lower East Side. He had a big following there. And most of his legal writings are called Igrot Moshe, which means the letters of Moshe. And people would add, this is how Jewish law develops, people would ask him a question, and then it's called responsa, and he would respond. And somebody asked him, like, well, if I'm going to be married to somebody today, do they need to cover their hair? And the bottom line, he says, is no, do not. They do not. And I want to read the last part for her, last part here. In other words, he's not going to be required to divorce her and give her and not give her ketubah. And notice that this last part here, and it should say, and nowadays, if she did not say to him before the marriage that she would cover her hair, he could not rely on that assumption that she would cover her hair. And as though he knew and accepted, and thus has no relevance to the law of losing her ketubah. So what does he say to her? What does this mean? It means, well, it does not rise to the level of something that would be considered a biblical transgression, and there's no problem. And in other places, I don't know if it's in this particular letter, we're going to see him again in a second, that he basically says, well, women nowadays who are very modest don't cover their hair that are married. This is what people do, and it's certainly not grounds for divorce. It doesn't rise to that level. And what he recognizes is that women nowadays, meaning the practice of married women that he sees within the Jewish community, as many of them don't. And and also he does not want to cast aspersions on these women at all. So this was a big, big turning point. However, he would say that the better way to go is for a woman, at least when she's out in public, to wear, to cover her hair in some manner. We'll talk about amounts in a second, but at least there's an understanding. And the way that he's able to get there, I believe, is because they could not find a way, even with strong statements from the Rambam, from Maimonides, to really hook it into a biblical law. It leaves a lot of leeway. And they're also leaving it to the practices of Banot Yisrael, the daughters of Israel. What do they do? Another question that is to think about, which actually is kind of going back a little bit, is that, well, if you have your hair uncovered in, let's say, in your home, is that considered to be immodest? And there's many different discussions of exactly how much need to be covered. And this, we'll see some dichotomies here. So I want to talk, we're coming back again. We're going back to our Gemara in Ketubot. And they said, well, listen, if we require every single woman in her own home to cover her hair, and if she doesn't, married woman to cover her hair within her own home, and she doesn't, her husband is going to be grounds for divorce. There'll be nobody married. It's just not going to work. So it's an idea that then gets put forward that within the home, perhaps a married woman does not have to cover her hair. That if she's in her own confines, she's not in public, she does not have to cover her hair. And he saw that as a practice as well. And I think that's also what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was looking at. And again, the idea is if we have it so stringent, there's nobody follows this in their own home, they're not going to cover their hair. However, there's certainly a thread, and we're going to see this a little later, about certain women who had a practice to cover their hair in their home. And we're going to see where that comes from. And it becomes an argument within certain decisors within the Orthodox community of whether this is necessary or not. Okay, so let's, again, we have, these are, the next couple sources that I have here are talking about ideas of modesty in general and how women, perhaps maybe both married and unmarried women, should be covering their hair as well as a way of not enticing the other gender. Now, to be sure, these are rules that really are policing women's bodies. We're just going to be honest about that. But they realize that if it's too stringent, two things will happen. Married men won't be able to pray in their own homes if their wives are there, which would seem a little ridiculous. And also, if young people are courting, they want them to see if they're going to be physically compatible with one another. And if everything is covered up, it's just not going to work. So the idea that you will see, even within the Haredi community, within the ultra-Orthodox community, is that young girls do not cover their hair until they are married. They do, however, in some communities, make sure that their hair is braided or put back or done in some way, even to wear it as in a way that it's not parua. It doesn't look unkempt. It doesn't look wild. There's kind of like a little code work that if you're a little girl, you wear 2 braids. That means you're little. You're not on the market to look for a shidduch, to look for a match. When you're an older girl, you wear 1 braid. And your hair is done in a different way. But again, still kind of adhering to those ideas of modesty and that a woman's body should be covered in a certain way. There's an idea here that we have these. I have a lot of quotes from Maimonides about that. There was at least, she doesn't have to be as covered up within her home, and that is an important idea. So she might have to wear something on her head, but it doesn't have to be as covered up as when she goes into the marketplace. So we have these things combining. We have the modesty aspect combining, and we have the married aspect combining, and then general ideas of how women and girls, how they should present themselves. But they told the line as an idea that maybe that unmarried women can certainly go out with their hair uncovered. But the Rambam said no, because certainly girls, in all women within where he was, they all covered their hair. And certainly in specifically religious Muslim communities, girls, in some cases it's sometimes when they're very young, sometimes it's after puberty, that's when they will start to wear the hijab or whatever other manner of head covering it is within their community. So this is what he saw, but that seemed to be knocked down as not being practical, and it wasn't practical because the majority of Jews were not living in those kind of societies, and it wasn't going to be a problem. So I just want to move down a little bit. I'm sorry, I know this makes sometimes people a little dizzy when I move stuff down on the screen. I don't mean to make you dizzy, but there's the Rambam says that the idea that a woman is near a man anytime he's praying is not a great idea, even if they're married. But the other, some of his contemporaries and people a little bit later said, well, that's just really impractical. And he doesn't have to worry about that because he's married to her, knows her, and it won't be improper. And, as long as everybody is behaving themselves, then a woman can be there, but an idea that she has some degree of modesty in her clothing, in the way that she dresses. Okay, so now the question is, what do you cover? If you're coming from a place that you should cover, then what are you covering? What does it look like? Can you just wear a kerchief? Can you wear that basket on your head? Do you need to wear a thick headband, or do you wear a snood or a Sheitel or a wig? Where does this all come from, and how much needs to be covered? So I want to look at these specifics here, and then we will see how this also develops. So we have an idea that perhaps married women today, because of the societies that they live in, they don't need to cover their hair, and it certainly wouldn't be grounds for divorce. There's an idea that all women should present themselves modestly and maybe not go out completely disheveled. And even if they're not braiding their hair, if that's not the style, and a woman within her own home should be able to not have to cover her hair. Otherwise, that might be somewhat untenable, although there's certainly a thread that would require that. So if we look at the Shulchan Aruch, what's the Shulchan Aruch? The Shulchan Aruch is from the 15th century. It is the formative book of Jewish law, which codifies Jewish law. Its main author is the Mechaber, and who is representing Sephardic Jewry, and then the Ramah was Moshe Isserles, who is the gloss from the Ashkenazi communities. So here's what the Shulchan Aruch has to say. Hair of a woman, which is usually covered, it is forbidden to read Shema in her presence. And according to the Ramah, even if he's his wife, that's a stringency. But an unmarried woman for whom it's the norm to go without her head uncovered, it is permissible. Okay. And then the Ramah says, and the same holds true for hair of women which is normally goes outside the veil, and certainly a wig, even if it is normally covered. Meaning that you can have some hair like hanging out. We're going to talk about that in a second. But a married woman should have her hair covered at all times, and especially even when his husband is there. Okay. Again, we have from the Shulchan Aruch the second thing here, that again, this idea that Jewish daughters should not go out with their head uncovered in the marketplace, whether they're single or married. That seems to fall out of practice. Now, I want to look here at the Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham is Avraham Abeli Gobiner. He lived in the 17th century in Poland, and he had a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. This is just typical of all Jewish texts. Someone writes something, then someone writes a commentary, then someone writes a commentary on the commentary, which is called a super commentary. And we have layers and layers of how Jewish law develops. And notice what he talks about here. And we can say that the uncovered head that he refers to in the Even HaEzer, that's the Shulchan Aruch that we just read, that is referring to hair whose braids are undone, and she goes out into the marketplace, not covered. This is forbidden even for an unmarried woman. So it states Rashi in his commentary to the verse, and you shall let loose the woman's hair. The idea of being unkempt, even for unmarried women. And nonetheless, we must say that an unmarried woman is not biblically forbidden. For if we were to say that, the verse referring to an unmarried woman, if so, then it should be forbidden for her to go out with uncovered hair, with braids. For it is from this verse that the Talmud learns that Jewish women should not go out with uncovered heads. But really it's talking about something unbraided. So there's still this idea that whenever they're going out, even unmarried women, they should have their hair, if it's not covered, it should be done, not wild. I don't know how better to say that, but done in some way. And this idea of having braids without having a full hair covering certainly opens up another door of an idea of leniency, meaning I'm not going out with my hair completely covered, but it's held back in some way, or it's not wild. It's not, completely blowing in the breeze, so to speak. That this is something very, this is another way to think about it. Now, the other question that we have here is, well, how much do I need to cover? And could it be possible that I could cover it in a way but still have some hair showing? And then what those amounts turn out to be. So I'm going to look now at this responsa from the Khatam Sofer. So who is the Khatam Sofer? The Khatam Sofer was Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, who then became known as Moshe Sofer. He was born in Germany, but now he's buried and was part of a community that's now part of Bratislava, Slovakia. You know how those the maps in Europe where the borders would be changing all the time. Never know which people who lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they never knew where they were from day to day. And the Khatam Sofer was really important because as he was a 19th century a scholar for his community there that was part of his raison d'etre, so to speak, was against Reform Judaism, which just started then. So a lot of his stringencies, which he added to his community, meaning beyond just the letter of the law, he added a lot of stringencies were in response to Reform Judaism. His claim was that it was just the Judaism of old, but what he was actually doing was something quite innovative, although he was fighting against innovation. It's a great paradox. And the most Haredi, most ultra-Orthodox, trace their practice and their belief to the Khatam Sofer now, and especially those who come from Hungarian Jewry. Hungarian Jewry is really where what we think about ultra-Orthodoxy, that's really where it comes from, where you would see great stringencies added to Jewish law and practice, enough so that the women in their communities will have their hair covered within their homes as well. And a lot of this becomes, and he actually mentions this, that according, we're going to look at this now, of how he responds to this idea that perhaps these women are covering their hair even in their homes. And what he talks about in this very fascinating tshuva, responsa that he has here, is that he has this idea, someone comes to him and tells him that, we have in our community this practice of women who cover their hair, but they leave out like a row. Now this might be related to the braids, I really don't know, but they would leave out a row of hair. And that was the practice, and they thought, okay, that was fine. And the Khatam Sofer was happy that if that's how women were going to cover their hair, that's great. However, what he sees is that the custom of the women, this is interesting just at the end, but in our country, where the custom is according to the Zohar, this uproots the law. So it seemed that even he, the Khatam Sofer, who was trying to bring back a very kind of strict following of Jewish law, looked to the Jewish women in his community and saw that they were following something from the Zohar. So let me explain what that means. The Zohar is a book of Jewish mysticism. Those of you who might have, it's been popularized by like celebrities who follow Kabbalah. If they knew what the Zohar had to say about women, I think many of them would leave. But the Zohar is not particularly fond of women. And some of the most anti-woman, that's the best way I can describe it, comes from the Zohar. However, women in his community follow the idea of the Zohar that a woman should not have any of her hair showing in her home at any time. So these women, their agency, decided that this was going to be the practice. So their practice is very stringent. And notice what he says here. And in our country where the custom, whose custom? It's not his custom. He's looking to the practice of Jewish women, is that this is what they do. Now this opens the door for something else. It opens the door that, well, perhaps you live in another community, but the practice of the women there within the Jewish community is different. And so we again fly to the 20th century. We go back to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And this is another one of his responsa. And he has a very sharp critique of the Khatam Sofer, of this idea of women covering their hair, every bit of their hair, within their own homes. And he says, also what the Khatam Sofer was stringent to prohibit on the basis of Dat Yehudit, the faith of Jewish women, the practice of Jewish women, for a woman to be even in her room with a handkerchief on her head. Behold, the opinion of the Khatam Sofer in this manner is incomprehensible. He seems to find it, he finds it ridiculous. He doesn't understand how this could be. But he's admitting that where he gets it from is that's what the practice of the Jewish women did. So it's kind of a win-lose. Like, okay, we don't want women to have to cover every part of their hair in their own home, in their home with their families inside. But at the same time, the way that the Khatam Sofer justified this stringency was like, well, I looked at what the women did, and the women decided, okay, that's what we're doing. So that's the win lose here. I'm going to come to this last source here, and then I'm going to talk about what this looks like today. This last source is from Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin. He's a Rosh Yeshiva in Israel. He's written many different things about women within Halakha, within the modern Orthodox community. His wife, Hannah Henkin, Rabbanit Hannah Henkin, is the head of the Nishmat Seminary in Israel. She is also kind of revolutionary because she started the practice of teaching women to be halakhic advisors, yoetzet halakha, for family purity laws, which completely changed what that looks like in practice for modern Orthodox women, that they have actually female advisors for this very delicate and personal Jewish practice and Jewish law for couples that decide to follow those practices. And Rabbi Yehuda Henkin, he says very simply, when we talk about dat Yehudit, because remember, we had so much trouble trying to figure out if we could shove it into a biblical law, and it really becomes this idea of Jewish practice. When we look at Jewish practice of women, well, let's look at the women, and it's going to depend on the place and where they are. And he says here quite simply, for our purpose, it seems that dat Yehudit is dependent on the practice of the place. And I'm going to read the last two paragraphs here. This would lead to the leniency that in a place where women have the practice to uncover even more than a handbreadth, maybe one or two braids. A tefach is basically the size of your forehead, so that could be uncovered. If they have a practice to do a little bit outside of their hats, or even to uncover the hair going down to the shoulders, it would not be a problem of dat Yehudit, because most of the head is covered. So what is he saying? He's saying two things. He's saying, well, a married woman still needs to cover her hair in some ways, but how much and what it's going to look like is going to be dependent on where they are living. This is what seems appropriate to defend the practice of women and not to protest against the women who reveal more than a tefach. However, to adopt such a practice ab initio from the beginning should not be done, for just because we're able to make an argument does not mean that we should act upon it. Now, he's not going to go so far to say that a woman should not wear her hair uncovered, or maybe the best practice is to cover more, and then if you're in a place where they cover less, okay, it's really okay. Now, the second article that I shared with you was a groundbreaking article written in 2010 by Rabbi Michael Broid. He's a modern Orthodox rabbi. He is also a law professor at Emory Law School. He lives in Atlanta. And he wrote this groundbreaking article for Tradition Magazine. Tradition Magazine is actually where modern responsa within the Orthodox community very much find themselves, and modern Jewish scholarship comes to that magazine. So it's a journal. It's not just, it's a serious intellectual academic journal for the Jewish community. And he wrote this very detailed responsa where he came to the conclusion. He went a little further than Rav Henkin, and what he says is that everything is dependent on the practice of Jewish women. So what that means is that how a woman will cover her hair and what the societal norms are really dat Yehudit, what the practice is of the women. We're going to throw it in that category because that's where it really is. And it would depend on which community and what the outside community looks like. So in practical terms, it means in the United States of America, you might be in Jewish communities or general communities where women don't cover their hair. Professional women, people don't go out. They want to have their hair done. They want to look professional. This is certainly one aspect, both for men and for women, but it's not necessarily the norm. If, however, I lived in a community that the community norm was to cover my hair, and maybe if the general community was to cover my hair, then I would be required to do so. So that would mean if I lived in Saudi Arabia, which I can't live in Saudi Arabia, but let's say I lived in Saudi Arabia, I would be required to cover my hair. Or let's say I lived in Israel. Now, married women in Israel, the overwhelming, you go out now, huge numbers of those women cover their hair. Or maybe it's also what the community norms are, what in your small Jewish community, what those norms would be. But essentially what Rabbi Broid does in two ways is that he really makes dat Yehudit the practice of the daughters of Israel, he throws it back into the hands of women to have agency, finally, to make that decision of what it's going to look like. So in my community, many, not all, but many married women cover their hair, but in their homes, they do not. They follow the shita that is understood, the opinion that is understood actually from the Rambam and from the Gemara, and that's a community norm for where I live. Now, not every woman covers their hair, but they do cover their hair when they are in synagogue, when we're ever going to get back inside our sanctuaries, and that is also learned from Sota. It's learned from this idea that when a woman was brought into the temple court, everybody covered their hair. It was a sign of respect. Married and unmarried women. This was something that people did. So if you want an idea of like, well, I'm only going to cover my hair when I'm in public worship in a sanctuary, you got it. Actually, from a biblical source of what happened there. So. This is the development now, and what's interesting is that we certainly have a wide range, and a lot of what that wide range is depending on which communities married women are finding themselves. That's really what it boils down to, and it has become more, and depending on what community that you're in, it's a personal choice that women are deciding to make, and it's very often how that they decide along with their marital partner. This is something that they will discuss, and it will depend on those norms. Before I started, I'm just going to tell you my personal journey for a second, then I'm going to talk about Zoom. Before I started Yeshivat Maharat, I only covered my hair when I was in public prayer. In public prayer settings, I would cover my hair. I wasn't worried that my husband was going to divorce me for not covering my hair. Wasn't any issue in that way, shape, or form. But when I started Yeshivat Maharat, it was the norm of that community that married women in the yeshiva would cover their hair in even the most minimal fashion, even if it was something that was just like a token idea. So I have a various range of hair coverings, from the big mitpachat that I'm wearing right now, a kind of kerchief and big headband, to sometimes, if I want to look very professional and not have to wear anything else, I do wear, I have a Sheitel. I have a couple wigs, which actually during quarantine have been fabulous because I haven't been able to go get my hair done and taken care of. And it depends on the situation for me. But in my home, I don't cover my hair. So why am I covering my hair now? There was a choice for me. I was thinking about it. I spent 4 years on Zoom in rabbinical school. And for certain things, when we had meetings with people outside of the yeshiva, I would cover my hair. And certainly when I was actually in the Beit Midrash, when I came there, I would cover my hair. So for Zoom meetings, if it's just a personal meeting, as if I was meeting someone in my home for like coffee, but if I'm in a professional mode where I'm teaching Torah and I'm inviting all of you, it's as if we're having a meeting. And certainly it feels that way. It feels more of a public space, but it doesn't always feel that way. So again, it's a personal decision that I have made. I don't know what everybody else's decision. A lot of women who are my colleagues cover their hair all the time, even within their own homes. And that's the decision that they have made for themselves. So what this has turned out to be is that a lot of how the Halakha, the Jewish law, really developed was looking at what the practice of what women were doing. Even if that didn't totally come out explicitly within Jewish legal writings. But what it comes down to every time is they look at Dat Yehudit, and if Dat Yehudit really means the practice of women, then either you're going to have to take it or not. So that's where it remains now. And as far as a range, you have women who are coming in the ultra-Orthodox community, and they're following all the way back from the Chatam Sofer, where they're covering every part of their hair, even within their own homes, at all time. Unmarried women are still not covering their hair. That's still, I'm just waiting for that to change, but hopefully it won't for a lot of different reasons. So you see a range of that, a range of all sorts of different hair coverings, and a lot of it is dependent on community. But I would like to think in all these places that there's the agency to women has been returned, that they can make those decisions. And it's a family decision as well. I have many friends who cover their hair. They only use scarves or what we call a tichel or hair companies, or you'll see these, especially in Israel now, it's very popular. You see the actually the fashion of head coverings, certainly out of Israel. So now it's these kind of turban kind of things, which are fabulous. I don't think I could pull it off, but that seems to be the style. And a lot of it's a personal decision. Like my kids and my husband hate when I wear a sheitel. They hate it. They hate it, but it's my decision. So these are the range of options that people have now, and it's from their tradition and how they see this law. If they see it coming from something from the Zohar, or really something that's something biblical, they're going to be more stringent about what that looks like. If they see it as something that comes from the practice of modest Jewish women, something as a value of modesty in the way that they comport themselves, then it might look a little different. So that's really like a lot of hair covering, a lot of material on one foot, and I hope that that it's been informative. I hope it's been enlightening as to why there's such a range in practice today, I think more than ever, and understanding why certain women do what they do. And I think we can go to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Would you mind stopping your screen share? People wanted to.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you so much. So we did have a few questions here. Going back to, do the Haredis still have shave the head of a newly married woman?
Some do, and that is, it's based on kind of a unfortunate societal experience that they had, that they were living in communities where the non-Jewish ruler of the community had right to every young bride first before marriage. And so the idea was to make them as unattractive as possible. It also comes from a biblical situation where a man who's in war, if he really wants a woman that he has captured, a captured woman, she has to make herself ugly. And if he still wants her and loves her, then he can marry her. So it's a very unfortunate kind of practice, in my opinion. Another reason why they do that is because they're very scrupulous about their mikvah practices. And when you're preparing for the mikvah, half the time of what you're doing is all about your hair. Do you have a knot in your hair? Are you combing out your hair? So if you have very short hair or a shaved head, the idea that there would be any blockage of the water when you're going for your monthly mikvah visit, that won't be an issue. And it's certainly that's one of the reasons why that women still do this. There's been some pushback every now and then within the communities, but for a lot of those women, I don't want to say that they're oppressed. I don't want to say that they have no agency. I think that's very dangerous for us who are not living that life to say that about other women. And so that doesn't mean that some women might not feel that way. But I don't want to take agency totally out of their hands, because in certain things, it's who's shaving the heads of the brides. It's the mother and the mother-in-law who go over the day after the wedding, and that's what they do. This is something that's their dat yehudit. That is the practice of those women. So it's I think for us who don't have that practice, it seems very strange. It seems very oppressive. It seems very uncomfortable. But at the same time, this is something that they have agency over. So that's just something to keep in mind when we look at other practices.
Yeah, thank you. There's another one having to do with requirement of covering one's hair in terms of, she's asking specifically about the headband. Like, how does a headband meet the requirement of covering one's hair? And you've spoken about, like, there's the snood, there's a tichel, right, there's the turban. You know, sometimes people leave their bangs out, right? Which goes back to some sources. So,
right. So we touched upon it briefly, of an idea certainly of a forehead's worth of hair showing. And as far as just covering a minimal amount, we actually see that in sources regarding, well, how much of the head was uncovered of the sota? Was it just a little bit? Was it the whole deal? Because if it's the whole deal, then you got to cover the whole deal. And so there are a lot of arguments about that, that again, allow for some degree of leniency. So what has become practice now, which is quite interesting, is that something that I'm wearing a headband that is at least 4 inches. So 4 inches would make that tefach, that's what I would be covering as the barest minimum. And I'll tell you right now, this is the barest minimum that would be considered. Although I have friends who wear something, sometimes it might be thinner, and it's really more of a nod to the practice, a nod of showing a degree of respect for the practice and honoring what our foremothers have done, and instead of even if it's not completely covering your hair. So that's where you have the amounts. So you have some that won't show any hair, some that they'll have like a bang out or bangs out, or also if they're not wearing a full wig, I've heard something called a fall. I don't know if you know what that is. That's like half a wig. And so if you'll see, if women wear that, they'll have like this much, and then the fall comes. And they might have a headband there just to kind of cover the edges, so that you don't see where the hair begins and the fall begins. So yes, the ranges are overwhelming. And then when you talk about wigs in and of themselves, that was a whole other vocabulary that I had no idea about, of length and human hair, and whether you have a lace front or how it clips, and it's just like a whole other universe in and of itself.
Is it, we have a couple other questions, but sticking with the headband, is it okay to go out in your neighborhood with just a headband on, or would you expect it to?
No, I do, but that's my practice, and there's a range of practice within my community. And it really only started when I was starting yeshiva, but my friends noticed. They noticed, like, oh, we see that this is what happening now. And really the requirement was from my yeshiva that whenever I was in Maharat mode, if I was teaching, then that would be the case. But in my community, people would see me, I was a student, I was in that mode all the time. So it just made it easier for me to just adopt this practice. And sometimes I wear a hat, sometimes, it could be a range, and sometimes it's just whatever I'm grabbing out the door. So that's the case.
Great. I have 2 questions related to wigs. One, just being curious about wigs in general as a hair covering, because it is like as if, k'ilu, as if it's hair.
Right.
And then another question related to a woman that knows somebody else who's divorced, and her rabbi, I guess, expressed that she should continue wearing her wig, even though, or she should not continue wearing her wig. She should continue to cover her hair even though she's divorced.
Okay. So I want to talk about the first thing about of wearing a wig. My wigs look fantastic. They look like my hair. So if the point is to show degree of not, heaven forfend, and enticing another man besides my husband, I've been married almost 28 years. So this, I don't even think about that anymore. There is a division. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi and was a huge giant in Torah learning and wrote a ton of halachic responsa. In his community, the women cannot wear wigs. They have to cover their hair with mitpachat, with a kerchief or a turban or whatever. And that's his tradition. And the point being is that he thought it was somewhat defeatist. If it was supposed to be for modesty, like sometimes the hair looks better than what they would have had, even if it's their real hair. And I'm going to tell you a true story. My husband was in medical school, and one of his classmates was a Jewish married woman who had a beautiful sheitel. And one of his friends said to him, "Oh, I'd really like to ask her out, but I know that she's married, but she's so nice, and she has such wonderful hair." And my husband, he knew that she wore a sheitel, and he didn't have the heart to tell him, like, I'm really sorry, it's not her hair. Like, didn't want to, hurt him too much. He was already kind of sad. Now, as far as communities that allow for women to wear wigs, it seemed to be that women were doing it anyway. it was one case where really dat Yehudit, that the practice of the women was they wanted to look nice and they wanted to be able to look professional because they were going out into the professional world. And the practice picked up because women were doing it. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not pullback and pushback every now and then. So there was an idea, that maybe you should not have your wigs too long, the very long wigs, that maybe it should be shorter. Or in the Satmar community, the women their heads are shaved, they wear a wig, and then they wear a hat on top of the wig. So if you want to know who the Satmar women, when you're in your community, you can point them out. That's their extra stringency. So a lot of the pushback happens every now and then, but because it was so ingrained in Dat Yehudit, because of women's practice, that they found that it was going to be really hard to get rid of it. And so the power of how Jewish women want to present themselves as modest, but they want to be fashionable. They want, and they're working out in the world and they're doing all these things. They're not home all the time and they want to look good. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that was the power of Dat Yehudit in a real way that we saw right now.
Interesting. And then the last question about a woman who is divorced was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a wide range of opinions of women who are divorced, whether they should continue covering their hair. There are some opinions that if she's trying to date and wants to get remarried, that in those situations, she does not have to wear her sheitel. And it just depends on the orientation of the halachic advisor who you're asking the question to. So in certain communities, their practices, this is what the practice has been. And I would say that it was probably adopted by women as well. But there's certainly a range of opinion. Not that you should shop around, but there is, certainly opinions that would allow for, especially if she was dating again, to allow that to be. But again, it's dependent. Again, this is dependent on behavior regarding a man. That's what makes it more difficult. I think that it's dependent on the needs for a man. Although if she wants to get, the idea is that they would really like her to get remarried again, that they don't want to impede that practice.
You're being very generous with your time. Does that, we have two more areas and then I think we'll end because it's over time and it's getting late. If someone is a widow, does that also translate in terms of similar thinking with somebody?
Yeah. So definitely similar thinking. And I liken it a little bit to, you'll see widows who might still wear their wedding rings, that this was their practice, and that might be included in the practice, that this is how they were as a married person. They might continue to do that. But especially if you're going to date somebody, then it seems that there's a lot of halachic advisors who would say that would be okay. Although I've known many divorced women who they were divorced and that was it. They did not cover their hair anymore. It was because covering their hair was a symbol of their marriage, which had failed, and so that was their practice. So I think there's a wider range of practice, but for widow, very often this was their marital practice. You'll see that very often, that they wear their wedding rings. They do things that they did when they were married to honor their partner. So that's that again. But it's a range of custom and it's a range of practice.
Right. Beautiful. Thank you. And then lastly, the doilies that synagogues hand out to women.
We could have a whole day talking about the doilies.
Yeah.
Well, it's coming from the practice that much of our synagogue practice is reflecting what temple practice was, or at least what we thought it was. So even in the way that we arrange how we seat ourselves, and the idea of all those things are a way to kind of replicate what temple worship looked like. And so when people went to the temple, male or female, they would cover their hair. So it's a very slight remnant of that kind of practice, which is just involved in synagogue practice in and of itself. how our synagogue worship looks like, how the actual physical spaces, and how we present ourselves when we go for public prayer.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. You've been so generous and so informative. Marlene, did you want to close with anything in particular?
I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us. Again, if you have any questions about the sisterhood, or if you are not currently on our mailing list, please email me. My email is in the chat, but we're going to lose it in a minute. It is MREIDDPM at Gmail. It's MREIDDPM at Gmail. We'd love to get you on our mailing list. Rabbi Novak, thank you so much. This was great, and we look forward to having you again.
Thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure learning with all of you, and your questions were awesome. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
Rabbi Novak, can you tell me your father's name?
David.
David Novak.
David
And
Novak.
I believe